Welcome to the Mansfield Podcast, your guide to U.S.-Asia policy. Today we're joined by Crystal Pryor, Senior Advisor at Pacific Forum and a Senior Fellow at the University of Albany's Center for Policy Research. Dr. Pryor was previously Director of Research at Pacific Forum. She is a member of the 5th cohort of the Mansfield Foundation's U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. She joined us in spring 2023 to discuss her career as a policy practitioner in the Japan field, as well as the current trends in export control of critical technologies. Okay, Crystal, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we'd like to start off by just having you introduce what is it that you're working on?
Sure. Well, right now I'm doing a lot of work in sort of the strategic trade control space. So essentially looking at how countries implement their export controls and other kinds of controls, looking at sensitive technology imports and exports.
And we'll get into some of those export controls and chip manufacturing stuff in greater detail in just a bit. But you're Director of Research at Pacific Forum, and you've got a lot of experience looking into things like space security cooperation and arms control and women, peace, and security. So how is it that you choose a topic of research to focus on, and what has led you in the last few months and last few years to be focused on export controls?
That's a great question. Sometimes the topics choose us, especially in the nonprofit world. Sometimes we're driven a little bit by the direction in which, the government's moving or that funding streams occur. So that's actually more the case with women, peace, and security for me. I'm just inherently interested in the topic as a woman working in the security space and sort of seeing what some of the obstacles are, to women in the field. And so that's something that more came to me, and I jumped on the opportunity when it presented itself, but it wasn't necessarily something I went looking for. It was one of many things I was looking at. With regards to export controls, I initially got into it. I had the chance to be one of the first Japan fellows at the East-West Center in Washington back in 2012. And I was very interested in this space security topic, which he just mentioned. And I was looking at basically how the US and Japan could coordinate or collaborate in outer space security policy. And I wanted to look at other regional players as well. It was difficult to look at the big regional player. It was a little bit hard to get too much information on, but lots on US Japan. And in doing that, I learned that essentially 99% of outer space assets are dual use. And that means that they are subject to export controls. And so I've just been fascinated throughout my career by this idea of how countries balance economic and security concerns or economic and security interests. And so the topic of sort of dual use export controls, how do countries decide whether or not to control the export of a certain technology, usually high tech, usually high value. And then once they've decided to control it, whether or not to actually allow the export of a certain controlled technology to a certain destination or a certain end user. Countries have to balance. They have to balance their things that they're worried about in terms of national security, in terms of international security, in terms of nonproliferation, with their economic interests and making sure that their businesses are competitive and that they're able to export on a fair ground to other competitors, maybe in other countries. So that's how I got into the topic of export controls. In particular, Japan had just been lifting the US had been lifting some of the restrictions on Japan's ability to do satellite-related exports. And so that was sort of the trigger for the rest of the next 10 plus years of my career.
So you can see how you move from that space background and start to delve more into export controls. Of course, we've been seeing a lot of conversation about export controls, and particularly in the semiconductor space, just in the last few months. And I know you've been looking at the Chips and Science Act that was passed by the United States back last summer, as well as American efforts to control some of those exports to China and get our allies involved in those efforts as well. So can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, again, I'm not a semiconductor expert by any means. I'll be the first to admit that. But this topic just really epitomizes those research interests because semiconductors are so critical and so foundational to both our economics and to our security. And so, what better lens to look at how countries are trying to manage these, shared concerns that have to do with both economics and security than looking at what the US is trying to do and how do we get our allies on board? I mean, this is always the discussion in the export control field generally. If one country is placing export controls or practicing export controls, and another country is not even worried about it, and then there's no point in the first country having implemented those export controls. It only harms the country that's implementing if it's not implemented consistently. So it's so important to have allies on board. The US and Japan is the number one ally for the United States. And so if we can't even get Japan on board, then we have problems. And so it's just really interesting to look at how the US is trying to persuade other countries to sort of see things in the same terms or in the same light that the United States does. And that I think there's big assumptions there. I mean, do we have the same shared security threats? And then also, do we see the relative importance of our economies in the same way?
And you mentioned that the big player in this space that it's harder to get an understanding of is China. China is a large market for a lot of these technologies, and they seem to be the target of a lot of export control rules being passed by the United States. And I think we want to start off by talking about the American efforts to get our partners in Japan and the Netherlands to match our export controls. Can you talk about what it is that we're trying to get Japan and the Netherlands to do, and how it is that these are the two countries that we're spending a lot of effort negotiating with?
Yeah, so to respond to the second question, it's because Japan and the Netherlands make components that only they can make, that if the US calls them choke point technologies. So if the US is able to sort of get these types of technologies out of the semiconductor ecosystem that's available to China, then it really does slow down China's ability to get to those, or be able to domestically produce those the most advanced semiconductors. So we're targeting the countries both that are creating some of the critical technologies, but also ones that I think that the U.S. thinks are a little bit more amenable to listening to what it thinks the U.S. security threats are and the ways that they need to be managed. So Korea also creates a lot of these critical technologies too, but I think that the challenge there is taller. And to Taiwan too, also. There's different challenges with different countries, of course, political and otherwise. But the goal is really how can we slow down China's development of these advanced semiconductors, and what key components or technologies can we keep so that we can kind of keep our advantage in the production of the semiconductors. Whether or not that's doable or achievable is a separate question, but I think that's the general rationale behind it.
Let's talk to our audience a little bit about what it is about China that causes the United States to be so concerned about their rapid development of this. Is this a security concern? Is this a supply chain concern? Is it that America just doesn't like to have peer competitors in this space? What is driving the fact that we are now working with all of our allies across the world to try to constrain China's development of these technologies?
I think it's a mix of factors. I would say top, though, is China's military threat, and that's potential destabilizing influence in the region, but the broader implications, of course, if the US were to get caught up in any sort of confrontation with China. So I do think that that's there. We, of course, in some ways did similar things with Japan back in the 1980s. And I think the key difference, though, is that we never saw Japan as a security threat. We never, thought its military to be of concern to the United States, or we're concerned about Japan encroaching on its neighbors' territory or something like that. So, fundamentally, it was more of an economic discussion and not really pushed by this national security or national security or stability concerns. So I think the discussion really is quite different there in terms of what informs U.S. policy and also U.S. outreach to our allies. I think some of this is also China's own doing. The Made in China 2025 plan definitely raised hairs on the backs of American policymakers' necks. I think we got really worried about China's ability to actually execute on this. And, it was an ambitious plan on China's part. I don't necessarily know that they meant it to be sort of a public diplomacy or sort of outward leaning type of policy, but it was definitely picked up and sort of used or abused in U.S. policymaking circles. So some of it is China's own rhetoric or its own plans, which may or may not be more domestically oriented, but they're there, and they've been somewhat successful in doing the things that they've been doing, BRI among other things, and they really have been able to funnel a lot of funds into at least developing certain technology areas. That said, we haven't been super successful in all of them yet. So I think it's the national security threat that China perceives, that the United States perceives from China, the international security threat that the United States perceives from China, China's own policies and approaches. And then I think there is some momentum in the region to oppose China or to stand up to China. I don't think there was the same momentum maybe 10 years ago, but the more that sort of China is successful with BRI or, this kind of predatory investments or taking over certain portions of the Pacific or whatever it is, I think the more that countries are starting to get concerned about the behavior. And then, of course, it's human rights abuses that some of the European countries are more concerned about. So I think that there is some momentum there that the US is also trying to capitalize on and try to sort of seize the moment. I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a lot of parallels have been made to whether China could do something similar to Taiwan or whether it would. I don't actually know if that parallel makes a ton of sense. I'm not sure actually what China is learning from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think that's an interesting question, but there's that momentum is there too. Like the idea that we have to sort of stand up to bad actors and really come together as one. And I think that the US, is trying to capitalize on the moment. Some of it, of course, it just comes down to the technologies themselves and how important they are and how critical to the functioning of our day-to-day life they've become. The military itself is so dependent on semiconductors and our day-to-day lives are and our cars are and everything else. So I think that realization was definitely heightened during the COVID-19 pandemic and supply chain disturbances. So it's a lot of different things coming together at this moment in time.
Help me understand, is there a concern that China will develop these, whether we are successful in imposing these export controls, not just from the United States, but from our allies as well?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think indigenization is a major concern. But as you sort of suggested in the last part of your question, the more that we practice, the more successful that we are in practicing these export controls, the more push there is for China to indigenize these technologies and be able to develop them without plugging into the overseas supply chain. So that's definitely a concern that I have. I think IP theft, of course, it's a big one, and especially the private sector is concerned about it. I don't actually know if that's like the biggest concern for government. I think it's more to do with like the espionage, everything that's going on with the 5G networks and Huawei. And the concern is more having Chinese technology as a part of systems that we need to be reliable and need to be secure. And the idea that, China could maybe eavesdrop or tap or somehow make the system not work anymore or hold back, as it's done with critical minerals and other things in the past, hold back on a particular technology if we do get into some sort of a confrontation where we're dependent on them for a particular item and then we're no longer able to get it.
You've briefly introduced the countries that are involved in this, but the key term that's come up in recent months in this space is the Fab Four. Unfortunately, we're not talking about the Beatles here, but can you talk about what the U.S. is hoping to accomplish with the Fab Four?
Sure. The idea makes a lot of sense. It's bring together some of the biggest players in the semiconductor market in East Asia, which are South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and then, of course, the United States working together with these countries to come to some sort of place where they can essentially build China out of the semiconductor ecosystem. The idea is that this will help resiliency. This will help with any sort of supply chain disturbances like we mentioned before. And so if we can at least get the countries to agree to work together to develop the technologies that they don't already have or to sort of share across borders the ones that they do in a more coordinated or harmonized way, that could help with the concerns that the United States has about China being part of the semiconductor supply chain.
And you're working on a piece right now that makes the case that each of these countries in the Fab Four has different tolerances for how aggressively they want to be in keeping China out and different degrees to which they are willing to follow the United States into a more open confrontation with China. So how is it that the United States is managing each of those relationships in Seoul, Taipei, and Tokyo? Are we using different strategies for each, or are we trying to adopt a one-size-fits-all?
I think that we're adopting different strategies to each. Of course, types of discussions that are going on are not made public, and so it's hard to know exactly how the United States is applying pressure in different ways. But I think the U.S. is cognizant that the same approach that works for Japan is definitely not going to work for South Korea. And so it's just a really interesting problem because, first of all, the countries produce different things. They have different, market positions vis-a-vis China, and they have different political relationships with China. And then they also maybe balance their political and economic security concerns differently than each other and than the United States. So how you kind of get these countries to come to a consensus or even any sort of agreement, I think is a really tricky question. But apparently there was a second meeting recently, about a week ago. And so they're meeting and they're talking, at least everyone's willing to talk about it, which I think actually is a great first start.
So that brings us to kind of the logical question about all of this is what policies should we be looking for in the coming weeks and months? Should we be seeing some public announcements of how closely Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan are moving in concert with the United States? Will each of them be coming up with their own version of the Science and Chips Act? What can we be looking for?
Oh, I don't think anything's going to happen in the coming weeks. I'd be shocked if it did. It'd be great, if around the end of 2023, if we saw some sort of general consensus or agreement on ways in which the countries might coordinate. They're definitely not going to mention China directly in any sort of statement that's made. And they're also probably not going to bring in the topic of export controls. I think it's just too sensitive and too much of a third rail for these discussions.
So it'll be positioned more as a supply chain resiliency issue rather than a countering China or even export control issue.
Yep.
So you're a member of the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future. Of course, this group includes many academics and also practitioners such as yourself. Can you talk a little bit about how you made the choice to go into more research-focused work rather than into academia?
Sure. It's definitely a decision I struggled with for a bit. I think that actually, as I mentioned, I was at the East-West Center in Washington, and I just really got a flavor for the policy world while I was there and liked it a lot. I wasn't sure if I should kind of continue on with my PhD or not at that stage. I had just finished my master's and hadn't taken my PhD exams yet. But the resounding answer was, I don't know. People couldn't tell me one way or another whether I should go on to the PhD. But I thought having the credentials would help me in my future career, which I knew I wanted to be in research and I wanted to be in policy at that point. So I think my general feeling about academia is political science in particular, which is my field, is it's gotten so distanced from being able to make policy recommendations or to put out output that helps policymakers like on a day-to-day basis. I mean, political scientists do amazing work and they're so smart, but to have something that's actually actionable for a policymaker, it has to be like quick and it has to be easily digestible. And I guess I wanted to be a little bit more on the useful space in terms of like rapid decision making and policy making. So that's sort of where I came in. But of course, I still value my academic training. And I think it really has helped me when I'm doing more policy relevant work to make sure I'm being rigorous. And I can explain a little bit about the research that I'm doing, not related to Japan directly, but that's really, for me, epitomized how to sort of balance or cross that bridge between academia and policy work.
That's the whole point of the U.S.-Japan Network for the Future program, is to help refine some of that deep expertise into policy relevant forms that are digestible by policymakers. You're in a rather unique situation where you had already begun that journey to better understand that process before you entered the network. So I'm curious to hear what you gained from the network experience.
Since I've been in this policy space for over 5 years now, it was just, first of all, just really nice to reconnect with academics who are doing academic work. I love hearing about what people are, so seriously studying and working on, and with just really deep expertise on all sorts of different topics with regards to Japan. As I said, I'm a political scientist, so I don't necessarily know that much about anthropology or, Japan's aging society or other topics. So I think just the ability to connect with so many interesting people working on so many different aspects of Japan was just a great learning experience for me. I mean, then some of the trainings that we did, even though I'm already in the policy space, like the media training that we did was really useful. And I could immediately draw on some of those skills that I learned when I have to, be on the local television skit or whatever. And they ask me questions about things I really often have no particular background on, but you just have to be able to respond. Sort of being forced to really put my Japan thinking cap on, because I sometimes get pulled away a little bit from that line of work. As I mentioned in the beginning, sometimes we get funding for other things and I have to work on that topic next. I don't always get to work on, my favorite topics. And I love working on Japan. So it's forced me to like keep my Japan cap on a little bit and stay engaged in that field. And even, being pushed to write on a topic that I wouldn't necessarily have been working on otherwise.
You've mentioned a few times that your work at Pacific Forum extends beyond Japan. So can you talk a little bit about what it is that Pacific Forum does and some of the other areas that you're working on these days?
Sure. So we work on foreign and security policy in the Indo-Pacific. So our work is pretty much as broad as what I just said. Traditionally, our work, we've been stronger in East Asia, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, but we're increasingly expanding into Oceania, the Pacific Islands, and also South Asia. So we're covering a lot of space in our work, and we do a mix of kind of closed-door dialogues as well as public diplomacy efforts. We also do research, and we have a fellows and internship program, as well as our young leaders, our flagship Next Generation program. So we do publications, research through that. And but I would say our bread and butter is really these sort of, we call them track 1.5 dialogues, where we have both government officials and people participating in their private capacities, private sector representatives, come and talk about difficult topics that maybe governments aren't able to resolve on their own.
Being somebody who has trained focused on Japan, you hold a master's degree from Todai in Japan. How has it been trying to expand your professional scope to encompass really all of Asia and all of the Pacific? Is that working different muscles that you weren't expecting earlier in your career? And what's that process been like?
I was definitely resistant for a while. I just wanted to be a Japan person, and I feel like people kept pushing me to be more of an Asia person. Japan's too narrow of a topic, or you can't just do Japan. And I was like, well, I think I can just do Japan. But I think I gave up at some point. But, I think coming from more of a Japan background does give me a different vantage point than not having that background. So, I think Japan's relationships with Southeast Asian countries and with the Pacific Islands are different to the United States relations. And so I have a different angle there, and I think I can learn a lot from that. I've been able to sort of apply my Japan expertise even in working in other countries in Asia, because Japan is so involved with all the other countries in Asia. But it's been uncomfortable at times, and I try to apply what I have learned from having such deep expertise in Japan. The one thing that I think I'll always have is the Japan language, which I spent a lot of time developing, many, many years. Mm-hmm. And that does provide me, I think, access to things that people who can't speak Japanese aren't able to have access to. And I think that's true of other countries too. I mean, of course, if I could speak Chinese or Korean or, any of the Southeast Asian languages, that would help me in my work as well. But I think my unique advantage, even in working in Asia, is going to be my ability to speak the Japanese language.
So a couple of weeks ago, you were in Tokyo working on some of these issues. Tell us what you were out there doing.
Sure. Yeah, I had the chance to attend the Asian Export Control Seminar, which is an annual conference run by the METI, the Keisansho, in Japan. And it's a really amazing conference because it brings together government representatives from really all the countries across Asia to talk about the developments of their export control systems. And so it's a great way to download a lot of information in a short period of time and reconnect with people who are working in this space. And so there's different, sort of meetings that are held on the sidelines of this event. And I was able to present the research that I've been working on at Pacific Forum, which is actually very academic. It's a quantitative study looking at essentially the economic benefits of adopting some sort of an export control system. And I was able to present that on the sidelines of the meeting to various countries that are in the region that are interested in adopting those controls. So it was a really nice blend for me of, first of all, being able to get back to Tokyo after the first time in 4 years, but also to be able to use my academic background and training to do policy work, basically, to be informing people who are making decisions for their governments about what the economic effects of export control implementation might be for them.
So for people who are just starting to get a grip on export controls, are there books, are there resources that you would recommend to people who can start to understand the issues at play here?
It's a great question. I did write a chapter on Japan's export control system published by a trade magazine called World ECR, but that covers some of the foundations.
Well, Crystal, it was great talking to you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
We hope you've enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Pryor. Her work, including a link to a 2022 article on economic vulnerabilities and a chapter on Japan's revised arms export regulations, is available in the description. Join us next time for a discussion on U.S.-Japan cooperation in the digital economy with Jordan Heiber. This season of the Mansfield Podcast is made possible with support from the Japan Foundation. Special thanks to Nick Velez for editing support. Music is courtesy of Laura Schwartz and Bellwether Bayou. Thank you, and I hope you'll join us again soon.